Hey everybody, pretty gloomy day today, wouldn't you say? You're gonna join me on my commute today, and we're gonna go from here to the church. I've got a meeting today with some pretty important people, and might I say right now how nice it is to be able to meet with people again. That's a nice change. It's a rare change. I wouldn't have thought that this would be that big of a deal, but here we are. It does matter. It is important. As nice as online things are, which they are, and I don't want you to think that they're not. Online things are nice, but they are not a comparison to meeting in person, especially not for a Christian. Something that happens in the Christian church, very early on in the Christian church, is that Jesus Christ creates community of people together. And he does this on purpose. Very expressly on purpose, making a case for having people living and working and growing and believing together as a group. From the word go, he finds disciples, plural, disciples them, makes them his ambassadors in the world, but also makes them into a community, into a church, into an ecclesia, as it's called in the scriptures. And right now, what we're finding happening is that if there was some fragmentation before, there's a lot of fragmentation now. And I do mean a lot of fragmentation now. There's fragmentation to the point where people are starting to be cut off from each other in a very hard, very deliberate way. Now, that was fine, I guess, while we were still going to things like Walmart and going to work and going to school, and still largely living atomized lives, especially compared to where our parents and grandparents used to be. But now that those things have either ground to a halt or become fundamentally changed, which they are different now, you've got to understand that even the act of going to the store is more distant than it used to be. People are not chit-chatting around. They're not taking their time. They're not sort of getting together and getting close. That's not happening at all now. Now they are all at a distance. You are doing one-way traffic for everything. The schools, when they resume, which they will be here very soon, are not going to be anywhere near as chummy or as communal as they were. Everything's getting different now, significantly so. So for a lot of people, the church is one of those few avenues of community left. And even though we have moved a lot of things online, there are some things that just can't do that way. You just cannot have a system worked out where you can be separated and atomized from the other believers and still remain a functioning church for very long. It doesn't work that way. So in a certain sense, as Christian people, you're going to have to get back together. You're going to have to reunite in some key capacity. What capacity is that? What's that going to look like? Well, we're going to have to figure that out. That's going to be part of the growing pains of the church in a pandemic. Because even here in Regina, Saskatchewan, there is no firm timetable as to when the church is going to open back up in a complete way. People have in mind that the church is going to be opening up in some way sometime soon. It's going to be open in a slightly different fashion. But if we're being honest with ourselves, there's no real firm promise of the church opening back up to where it was pre-pandemic anytime soon. So the church is going to have to reinvent in some way. It's going to have to do something a little bit different. It's going to have to work much harder to build community in the world. You can't just go back to your normal ways of doing things, your potlucks and whatnot. Not happening right now. But in some ways that's good, because what was happening up until this point was what we were saying, like every church was saying basically, that there's no reason to change, so why would we do things any differently? There was no reason to change the in-person community that we were building because there was no reason to do it. But now, there is. You don't have the choice of just assuming that potlucks and in-person Bible studies where you're gathered around one big table, that's going to cut it. Because now you don't have that choice, and you can either just sit there and wait until that comes back for the next year, 2 years, something like that. Or you can say more realistically that there is going to come a time at which your hand is being forced. Now, for us in the church, our hands were forced on the online issue quite substantially. That any church that was just dragging its heels and saying, we'll get to online, options eventually. Well, you're doing it now. You're either doing it now or you're in real serious trouble. It's the same way as that we're going to have to rethink what community is. It's going to have to be people in the church who genuinely care about each other, reaching out to each other, because man, at this point in our lives, nobody else will. And people, well, to go back to Genesis, it's not good for them to be alone. They're finding that out now, and they're finding it out aggressively. They don't want to be alone. They don't want to be cut off from each other. They don't want to be by themselves. As iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another, right? You need other people. You're built for that. That's the first thing that God said wasn't good, was when Adam was by himself. So what we're looking at then is a call to community, but a call to rethink what that community looks like. And in many ways, that's going to involve us being more deliberate with our community. It's going to involve us working harder on establishing a real, genuine community that takes effort, right? That takes work. Up until this point, as people my age and younger, man, we just let our parents run potlucks for forever and assumed they always would. But now that that's gone, that mantle, like it did from Elijah to Elisha, passes on to us. It says, okay, well, you are the people who desperately need community. You're the ones who are having community ripped away from you. What do you envisage that looking like? And that's a great question. One that we'll be thinking about more. One that we'll be talking about more. We've got to work this out with fear and trembling. And we're being pushed into doing so. Phase 1 of the pandemic, really, of our pandemic response is largely concluded. Phase 1 was, how do we survive as a church with non-in-person services, i.e. how do we get ourselves pushed to offering online options? Great, good, wonderful. Phase 2 is, how do we sustain it? Not how do we get there, that part is done now. You either did or you didn't. But question number 2 is now, how do you sustain it? How do you keep that going? How do you continue that for the long term? And that's, again, that's harder to do, and it's going to take more effort. All right, folks, that's the turn on to the church's drive. So that was my commute. 7 minutes long, and I thank you for joining me for it. It's a real pleasure to have you. You guys have yourselves a wonderful remainder of your Wednesday. See some of you tonight. See the rest of you at another time. Bye-bye for now.